Welcome everybody to our Siyum. I hope this will work, the hybrid, both Zoom and live. I'm going to first let our hostess, Erica Schwartz, say a few words.
Hi, everybody. I just want to welcome everybody. I'm Erica Schwartz. I'm a Daf Yomi listener since January 2020. And I think that's really what's so special about today, which is for those of us who started on this cycle, there were a very long time of Zoom and Daf Yomi being a very private, kind of solitary activity during a very difficult time. And so to see a turnout like this today, Michelle said it's her largest in-person Siyum in a really long time, is something very special and feels like a real blessing. And the other thing I just wanted to say very briefly was that as we've all, am I not in the mic? Can you hear me better now? Sorry. The other thing I just wanted to say is that, and this is kind of, piggybacks on the whole idea of the numbers here today, but I really enjoyed being the recipient of the RSVPs for this event. And I apologize to any of those that I missed somehow, but they came in droves. And what was so nice was I said to myself, I don't know any of these people. And they are all, or most of them, and they are all doing Daf Yomi too. And as we studied in this Masechet, and as we all know, kind of, forever since we were kids, but, if the Kamsa and Bar Kamsa story, completely captured the idea of Sinat Chinam, then uniting around something kind of so random a little bit, like Daf Yomi, one page of Gemara has the power to unite people across so many different communities, Jews across so many different backgrounds. And I think that perhaps my prayer is that the Daf Yomi community can be inspirational to all of the Jewish community, both here and in Israel, to constantly strive to find the things that unite us and kind of be on the same page as each other, find the things that put us on the same page as each other, both literally and figuratively. And we can kind of grow stronger that way as a community. So thank you all for coming, and I'm going to turn it over to Michelle.
First, I want to really thank Erica and Rob Schwartz for being such gracious hosts. And as you can see by the setup here, we could do a quick pan of the crowd. We have a whole setup here with the sun and the shade and trying to make room for everybody, and I hope everybody's comfortable. We're going to start with our daf. Today we're going to learn Gittin daf Sadi. We have a few sponsors for today's event. Siyum Gittin is sponsored by Sarah Borelowitz in loving memory of her mother, Klim Bonaim, Kila Bat Yehuda, Aleh Shalom, on her 10th year at site. Mer Neshama have an aliyah b'schut the learning of the wonderful Hadran Dafers and Rabbanit Michelle. Siyum Gittin is also sponsored by the Schuster family. It's a schut for the Fuah Shlema of Zev Ben Chana and Yisrael Ozer Ben. Today's topic, it's a very nice end of the Masechet, although a little bit tricky, but it's a whole new topic. We started a new Mishnah, which is nice. I know there's some people here who aren't learning the daf, and therefore you'll get a complete shiur. And the real question, the main topic of today's daf is under what circumstances, we're learning Gittin, which is about divorce, under what circumstances can a couple get divorced? It's a very interesting topic to think about. It's something that all religions really grapple with, which is divorce acceptable? Is it not acceptable, right? In Catholicism, it's not really acceptable. It's really done more by annulment if it is done at all, and it's frowned upon. In Hinduism, by the way, it was actually forbidden to divorce until recently. There was an act, the Hindu Marriage Act of 1955 in India allowed divorce under certain conditions. Listen to the list because this might sound familiar once we start learning the daf. Infidelity, abandonment, cruelty, and absence of communication, among other reasons. So the big question is, what does Judaism have to say about it? And the second question is, and anyone who's learning the daf knows, what does Judaism have to say about it is usually many different answers. There's no one clear answer. And the second question is going to be, well, if we're at the very end of Masechet Gittin, why wasn't this the first Mishnah of the Masechet, which is a big question that everybody asks. So with all those questions and thoughts in mind, we're going to start our daf. Beit Shammai Omrim. So everyone hopefully who's here should have pages with it on it. I think it was shared in the chat, and also you just really just need a regular Gemara. Beit Shammai Omrim. We're going to have a look at Beit Shammai, Beit Hillel, and then in is going to come Rabbi Akiva, who's actually from a later generation. So we'll have three opinions in this Mishnah. Beit Shammai Omrim lo yagaresh adam ishto ela im ken matza b'dvar erva. He said you can't divorce your wife unless you find some sort of erva, some sort of sexual misconduct. Shenemal, where does he get this from? And now maybe we should switch over for a minute into the psukim about marriage and divorce. Those who aren't learning Masechet Gittin might not be familiar with this, or you might be, but the Torah doesn't really say very much about marriage and divorce, even though it's such a strong Jewish value. There's very few psukim about it. And in fact, the topic of those psukim, anyone who's been learning with me knows we've said this a number of times, is not actually marriage. It's not actually divorce. It's, can you remarry your wife after you've divorced her? If she's married someone else, then you can no longer remarry her. That's really how the whole topic of marriage and divorce is introduced. And that's about the main place where it appears in the Torah, other than marriages that we see. But in terms of legal, that's where it appears. So I'm going to read you the psukim. It starts like this. Ki kach ish isha. When a man takes a woman, uve ala, and he has relations with her. Okay, it's a bit of a strange way to introduce it, which is basically those words is kiddushin. This is what we call marriage, okay, or betrothal, which then leads to marriage. The next line is, v'haya im lo timtzachem be'enav, if she doesn't find favor in his eyes, ki matzah be'ervat davar. Now here's where we're going to start getting the clues. Under what circumstances can someone divorce? Well, she doesn't find favor in his eyes. He finds some sort of erva, some sexual misconduct. And then it goes into V'katav l'sefer kritu v'natam b'yadav shel beito, which we spent many dapim talking about. We've never discussed these beginning words so much, though, in our Masechet yet. And then it says, she leaves his house, she goes and marries somebody else, because I said that's the whole topic here. And then the last person, the next husband, it's a hard word to say, sne'ah, he hates her, despises her, something, which also gives us another clue, right? These are two different descriptions. The first is he finds erva, or also she doesn't find favor in his eyes. The next is a little bit harsher, usne'ah, and then it says, and he gives her the divorce, etc., etc. And then it basically says, and then they can't remarry anymore. So that's about all we get in terms of the Torah telling us, is it okay to get divorced? So the rabbis are left with, how do we deal with these psukim, and what can we actually derive from them to get to the reality that we're looking for, which is it okay to get divorced, under what circumstances, etc. So the Mishnah continues. So Beit Shammai has the extreme opinion. He basically says, Ki matzah be'ervat davar. Because it says that, it seems only if there's sexual misconduct can this be done. Beit Hillel omrim afilu hikdicha tavshila. We now go seemingly to the other extreme. If she burns, some people translate this as oversalts his food. Okay, if she burns his food, he doesn't like the dinner she makes, that's good enough reason. Okay, that seems kind of like the other extreme. It's not like she did anything wrong, although one could say, there are commentaries who say, what do you mean? She burnt his food. Question of where on the scale these different opinions fall. Is Beit Shammai, what is ervat davar? Does this mean she actually committed adultery? Does it mean something less than that? Where on the scale Beit Shammai falls? Where on the scale Beit Hillel falls? Did she do something wrong, or did she, or just they don't get along, right? Like we said before. Communication problems, maybe I like my cookies soft, did she bake them hard, or something like that. So that's Beit Shammai and Beit Hillel. Comes in Rabbi Akiva in a later generation, and he also, by the way, quotes the exact same pasuk, which is very confusing. He says shenemal ki matzah be'ervat davar. Well, that's weird because he said it wasn't erva, so we'll have to wait for the Gemara to make that clear for us. Rabbi Akiva omer, afilu matzah acheret na'eh himena. Rabbi Akiva says, you know what? Maybe he finds someone he prefers. Now, by the way, this is very strange. Why is this strange? In those days, you were allowed to take two wives. So some people use this as a proof, and there's many proofs for this theory, that even though bigamy was actually permitted in those days, the rabbis were actually against bigamy, and they didn't believe in it, and they didn't think it should be done. And therefore, this is another possibility. He finds someone else to marry, and therefore, that's enough of grounds for divorce. On what basis does he say this? He said, why'd you skip the first part of the pasuk? It says, if she doesn't find favor in his eyes, so he decides he wants to marry someone else. Now, of course, as women, this whole thing is the man decides to divorce the woman. You have to remember, in Jewish law, the man is the one who can initiate and do the divorce, and not the woman, which is always a bit of a struggle for women. It's a bit of a problem of agunot. That's why we have all these agunah issues, which later my husband's going to talk a little bit about that. And again, the Torah was worded in the masculine. The rabbis were men. They were talking in the masculine. It doesn't mean that a couple can't get divorced because the woman decides this isn't working out, right? So, of course, he has to agree because otherwise he won't get the divorce, but it is worded in the masculine. We have to just address. Now the Gemara starts off. Tanya, it quotes a Braita where instead of just having the opinions of Beit Shammai, we're going to get a discussion. How did they prove their opinions? And we're going to have a bit of an argument, a rebuttal. Why do you say this? And what about this? Classic style of a Braita. Amru Beit Shammai, Beit Hillel Beit Shammai. V'halo kvar ne'emar davar. It doesn't just say erva. It says ervat davar. Comes Beit Hillel and says you're ignoring the word davar. Davar means a matter, a thing. So it could be something else. To which Amru lahem Beit Shammai, halo kvar ne'emar ervat. But what do you mean? The word davar is connected with the word ervat. In the Hebrew language, the taf is what we call smichut. It puts the two words together. It says ervat davar. That means this is one continuum. So it all relates to the erva. Amru lahem Beit Hillel. Im ne'emar ervat v'lo ne'emar davar hayiti omer mishum ervat tetzei. Mishum davar lo tetzei. If it had just said ervat and it wouldn't have said davar, Beit Hillel says, I would have thought that you can only divorce her because of erva, and because of davar, you can't divorce her. But l'chach ne'emar davar, but the word davar clearly, as you could have just said, ervat. So ervat would have meant just erva. The fact that it adds the word davar means either or. To which Beit Shammai says, sorry, I lost my place. Ve'ilu ne'emar davar. Okay, l'kach ne'emar davar. Ve'ilu ne'emar davar. So comes Beit Hillel and says, and if it just said davar, v'lo ne'emar erva, Beit Hillel has a weakness because it didn't need to mention the word erva at all. It could have just said davar, which would have meant any reason. So he says, but if it didn't say erva, what would I have thought? This is a very interesting thought. Hayiti omer mishum davar tinaseh la'achel, u'mishum erva lo tinaseh la'achel. What might I have thought? Remember this idea, because we're going to come back to it later, that perhaps if a woman engages in some sexual impropriety, something like that, then perhaps, remember what the Psukim said after. Not only do you get divorced, but then she goes and marries somebody else in the description of the Torah. Maybe if it just said davar, you would have thought if it was erva, that continuation of the pasuk wouldn't be true. She wouldn't be allowed to marry anybody else. Therefore, it comes to teach you, no, even if there was some sort of erva, he can divorce her, but she could actually marry somebody else. She's not forbidden to ever get married again. It doesn't, put a big on the blacklist that you cannot get married. So that's why Beit Hillel says you need also erva and also davar. Davar is coming to teach you on what basis can you divorce her. Erva is teaching you, even if it's erva, she can actually continue to the next pasuk and get remarried. So now they say, Ubeit Shammai, hi davar my avdele. Now, what does Beit Shammai do with davar? It should have just said erva, is what Beit Hillel said to them. So Beit Shammai rebuts and says, Ne'emar kan davar v'ne'emar lahalan davar. Oh, I learn here something else. What do I learn? A gzera shava. This is when two words appear in the same place. We learn from one to the other. It says in a different place, Apishnayim edim or pishlosha edim yakum davar. When you go to court, how do we establish something in Jewish law? 2 or 3 witnesses. I won't get into the 3. If it's 2, obviously you don't need 3. That's a whole, we'll get to that in a later Masechet, in Nezikin. But it says things have to be established by 2. So what do we learn from here? Mal halam b'shnei edim, afkan b'shnei edim. Now here they're talking about a different thing, which is if the wife really commits adultery, not just, let's say, something that maybe was a little less, which is possibly how we can understand Beit Shammai. If she really commits adultery, the husband has to divorce her. But he only has to divorce her if there's two witnesses. If he suspects her, then he doesn't have to. So that's a side point. Beit Hillel, what's he going to rebut? Miktiv erva bidaval. Doesn't say erva bidaval. If it had said erva on the matter, then it would have meant the davar is on the erva. But because it says erva daval, we can learn both. Okay, so Beit Hillel basically ends up learning both things. So therefore, he says, Beit Shammai rebuts, miktiv o erva o daval. If you think it's two possibilities, then it should have said either or. So there, I have a better proof than you. Ubeit Hillel lahachi ktiv ervat davar demashmahachi umashmahachi. He says it didn't say to teach you if it's erva, you need proof for it. And he didn't, and it said erva daval to teach you either erva or davar. So basically, we went through back and forth how each of them derived their opinions from the text. Now, you might be saying, especially if you're more new to Gemara, but even if you're not, this is how they prove their points, right? So there's always the fascinating question: what came first, the chicken or the egg, right? What was it? They knew that they each had their opinion, and then they connected it to the verse, or they actually derived it from the verse. Because they're both really working with the same words, in this case, it seems more, this was their opinion about, again, our basic question, under what circumstances can one get divorced? And Beit Shammai felt it had to be much more serious. It shouldn't be done in less extreme circumstances. And Beit Hillel wanted to say, no, there's a lot more circumstances in which a couple can get divorced. And therefore, each one kind of finds it in the psukim, because that's the way the game is played here. It's all through the verses. So now we go to Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva Omer, even if you find someone, he prefers b'mai kamiflage. So what's the machloket? And they're really going to point out here the machloket between the two extremes. We have Beit Shammai on the one hand, and we have Rabbi Akiva on the other hand, who says, really, you don't need a good reason. So now they say, what's really the root of the machloket? B'derish lakish. Now here we're going to go back again to the methods that they know, instead of discussing philosophically what's their debate about. Instead, they're going to go back to the verses. How do we read the verses? And it's going to go to something very basic. There's a really long Rashi on this. Anybody who wants to read it, we're not going to read it together, but it's a fascinating Rashi about how we view the word ki in the Torah. Okay, the word ki means, well, that's the problem. It could mean many different things. So that's going to be the debate, because remember it says ki matzah be'ervat daval. So the whole question is going to be what this word ki means. So amarish lakish. Ki mishamesh ba'alva lishanot. There's 4 different ways that ki could be used, and Rashi goes through each one and gives you examples in the Torah where the word ki means each of these different 4 interpretations. I, which is if, im, in Hebrew it's I is im, and if, dilma, perhaps, ella, but, deha, that. So let's fit this in. Beit Shammai savre vayam lo timsachem be'enav ki matzah be'ervat davar deha matzah be'ervat davar, because that he found among something wrong. That's Beit Shammai. Rabbi Akiva savar ki matzah be'ervat davar inami matzah be'ervat davar. Now here's a bit of a squeezing it of another word. I is if. The word inami in Aramaic means a second possibility. It means if also. You would never say this in English, but that's the literal translation, if also. So he says, if also you found by ervat davar. So either you didn't like her, you just preferred to marry somebody else instead of her, or you found ervat davar. And that's that's the basis of their debate. So we've now dealt with the psukim, how we get from the psukim, or how we really get from their idea, and how they each read it and interpret the text based on their understanding of, is divorce really not recommended only in extreme circumstances, or is it something that we allow kind of for any reason, or is it somewhere in the middle? And again, as I mentioned, the commentaries, if we drew out a scale, you would have different commentaries interpreting Beit Shammai and Beit food as something sexual. He actually says it's a euphemism for something sexual. So it's a debate where these things actually fall out. Now we're going to go to the next stage of the sugya, which is, we start to get some questions from the later generation. What if, according, now Rashi says we're talking about according to Beit Hillel, he divorces her anyway, even though she didn't burn his food. Okay, there was no erva, there was no daval, There was really no good reason. And he divorced her anyway. Do we make him undo it? How would you undo it? Remarry, right? Presumably. That's how Rashi explains it. Go with Rashi. Does he have to remarry the woman? Okay. Is he obligated because he did something wrong? He shouldn't have divorced her for that reason. Is he obligated to remarry? It sounds so absurd to us, right? That we force someone to remarry someone. But again, their times were different. And again, you have to always remember, and this is something my students know, which is much of these texts were written to, and these laws, and we're going to get to this particularly in another law, which you're going to be a little shocked by if you're not familiar with it, in another 2 minutes, which is these laws were meant to protect women. Women in general needed men in those days for financial security. And if they were left on their own, the father was supposed to handle her, but at a certain point, she kind of is on her own and she really doesn't have the support. And the husband is the one who's supposed to really support her. So if a woman is left without a match, she's really not protected. So this idea that if he divorces her for no reason is really meant to protect the woman and to say, we don't want your husband to just get up and immediately divorce you. We saw that, by the way, just recently with the get mikushal, right? Where we make the get a much more engaging process so that, and that's specifically for a Kohen, so that since the Kohen can never remarry her in case he feels like he made a mistake, so he doesn't divorce his wife quickly and then she's stuck. So the question is, how do they find an answer for this, right? Doesn't really say so in the Psukim. Amalei, well, we have a different example from which we can learn it. And this is a different technique. The first technique we saw was, let's learn it from within the verses that we know about marriage and divorce, but we've kind of run out because the Psukim don't really discuss that. So we have to look somewhere else. Rape in the Torah is always a very difficult situation because the Gemara describes man rapes a woman who's single, he's supposed to marry her. Okay, she can decide she doesn't want to marry her rapist, so she always has a way out. But in order to protect her, he's actually supposed to marry her, and he pays a penalty that goes usually to her father. So in this case, they say, what does it say by onus? Because he needs to marry her and she needs to be protected because, again, especially in those days, right? Who would want to marry a woman who was already raped? It was looked at very negatively, and therefore, again, thankfully, this is all changed in our day. Thankfully, so he says there, lo yuchal l'shalcha kol yamat. Not only does he have to marry her, but he is never allowed to divorce her. So what do the rabbis figure out here? Well, if he's not allowed to divorce her, kol yamat b'amo b'echzer, he always has to remarry her. Meaning if he divorced her every day of his life, he's obligated to remarry her until he takes care of it. But but it didn't say that in our psukim. So they use this as a foil because it didn't say it in our psukim. It must mean that in our case, they actually don't have to get remarried. Okay, he doesn't need to remarry. Now we get to even more, kind of about relationships and communication between couples. What if what if he wants to divorce his wife and she has no idea? Is that okay? Right? This is a question that you would ask, right? Is this okay? Can he be living with her and she's kind of functioning as his wife? And his plan is to divorce her, but he doesn't tell her. Kare ale, they say, we say about a person like this, don't ever plot evil against your friend. And he has no idea. He thinks, is sitting thinking in confidence, confidently in the relationship. So that is, the Gemara comes out and says, if you wanted to write, we go back to the communication idea. Communication is super important. We don't accept this in any way. Okay. Before this next section, I have to warn, this is not a section that's going to sound very good to any modern ear. So prepare yourselves. Okay. This is a section but in the end, we're going to read it and understand a little more of it. We're not going to like the language. They're going to compare women to food, and a case where a fly gets into your soup is going to be compared, or in your cup of wine, but we always think a fly in my soup, and can be compared to what you do when there's a fly in your soup, to what you do when you have a wife who is doing things that are inappropriate and it's not going. So be prepared, right? This happens a lot in the Gemara because their language, we all know that in the last X number of years, we've all become very sensitized to language and how we say things and how that might affect the person who's listening. In those days, this was a boys' club, and they didn't think women would ever be reading these texts for sure. And they didn't, it just wasn't, you have to just understand it it's the only way we can read these texts. Tanya, Haya Rabbi Meir Omer. Rabbi Meir was known to say, "Kashem shahadeot b'ma'achal kach deot b'nashim." The same way people feel about food, that's the way they feel about women. Yesh l'cha adam shezbuv nofel letoch koso, v'zorko ve'eno shoteu. A fly falls into your cup, you throw it out. You won't drink the cup. I'm sorry, you don't drink the cup at all. You won't. You're so disgusted by it, you throw everything out. You spill the whole cup instead of just taking the fly out. You have to remember, nowadays, thank God, we live in a world of plenty, and most people would just throw out the cup. But it happened to me last week. There was a bug in my water. I just dumped the water. But in those days, they recycled everything. They didn't want to spill out their cup of wine. So what does this mean in women? Well, midat papus ben Yehuda. You ready for this? He would lock his wife up. I just finished a book where a husband did this. It was like in the 1940s. And he would lock his wife in the house when he would leave, right? Horrible. And now the Gemara doesn't say this is a bad thing, but Rashi makes sure that you know that this is a bad thing. And he points out this. Papus ben Yehuda, by the way, appears, and this is my proof that Rashi must be definitely right. Rashi says at the end of the Rashi on the page, he says, what will happen? He says it's only going to create animosity between them and going to encourage her more to go out and cheat on him, right? What more? Obviously, if you treat her that way, she's going to rebel. So Papus ben Yehuda, we don't really have time, but you can look him up in Brachot Daf Samach Aleph Amud Bet. He's in a famous story from Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva gets put in jail. Before that, he's teaching Torah against the Roman decrees. And Papus ben Yehuda says to him, "Why are you doing that? Why are you teaching Torah? They said we shouldn't, you shouldn't." And he's clearly fighting with Rabbi Akiva about this issue. And then they both end up in jail. And he says to Rabbi Akiva, "You got in jail for a good reason. I got in jail for the wrong reason. In other words, you did the right thing by teaching Torah, and I was wrong." And I noticed the connection. Maybe you picked up on it. He gets put in jail, and he put his wife in jail, right? So you can almost say it's a midah keneged midah. All those who remember the last Masechet Sota with all of those. Okay, moving on. Next one. Yesh l'cha adam shezbuv nopel letoch koso v'zorko v'shoteu. Comes into his cup, he throws it out, and he drinks the cup. Zohi midat kol adam. And this is the Gemara's way of saying this is the normal way of doing things. Yes, and what is this? This is shemidaberet im achea v'krovea umenicha. She speaks with her relatives, her brothers, and he leaves her be. Some commentaries, the Tosfot read actually says she speaks with also her neighbors. In other words, he's not so jealous of every little thing that happens. That's totally fine. That's a norm. That's a good relationship. The yesh chazva adam. Now we're ready for the worst one. Shezvuv notel letoch tamchol. It falls into your cooked dish. Now we all know in kashrus, cooking means the flavor really gets in it. And motzitzo ve'ochlo, and he eats the whole thing. He sucks the fly. Zohi midat adam ra. This is a bad man. Shero'ed ishto yotza v'rosha parua v'tova b'shuk ufroma mishnei tzadeh urochetzet im bnei adam. This is a woman whose wife is going out doing things with other men. They use terms that in our terms don't sound so terrible. She goes out into the shuk with her. Usually that's associated right with. She goes out with her hair uncovered into the shuk. She goes through with her arms exposed, her body exposed on both sides, they say, and she bathes with other men. To which the Gemara says, "Im b'nei adam sakdatat." You really think she's bathing with other men? They couldn't imagine such a thing. Ela b'makom. They couldn't imagine that such a man would actually not divorce his wife if she was doing such a thing. Ela b'makom shebnei adam rochatzim. It's where people are bathing. She would go out when there were men bathing with, prancing about, kind of. Obviously, this must be a little more extreme than what they're describing. This woman, it's a mitzvah to divorce her. This hasn't been mentioned until this point. In this case, you actually really need to divorce her. And then notice the next pasuk is quoted again. She goes and marries somebody else. Why did they call him someone else? It could have just said she goes out and marries a person. It says Adam Achel. Why? This is a very interesting comment. They say he's not like the first husband. We're going to go back to what we talked about earlier. This one got rid of this bad woman that was in his house, and the second one married her. Remember we said that maybe it would be forbidden for her to marry at this point? Well, if she really for sure committed adultery, then they're basically saying whoever married her after is not a wise person, right? He brought her into his house. And then it goes into this drasha. Zacha sheni shalcha shenemar usnea ha'ish hacharon. It then gives two possibilities. Either because remember the pasuk there, for those who came late, the pasuk is if a woman gets married and then divorced, and then her husband, she marries someone else, and she wants to go back to her first husband, under what circumstances, right? It says either if he divorces her or if he dies, she still can't marry someone else, the first husband. It gives those two possibilities. So again, they do a drasha. What's their drasha? If he hates her, then if he's zacha, then he'll hate her and he'll divorce her. That would be a good thing. And if not, he will die. Okay, this is a way of just kind of the way the rabbis like to use extremes to say, we don't approve of this kind of behavior. Don't marry a woman who is an adulteress. Now they end with another machloket about the idea of when can someone divorce a woman. Ki saneh shalach. They quote a totally different pasuk. We now go into Nevi'im. We're in Trasar, a book of Malachi, which probably most of you haven't learned yet. There, he's in the beginning of the Second Temple period, and he uses this term. I won't give the whole context right now because of time, but he says, Ki saneh shalach. It's talking about a man who divorced his wife, and it says because, again, it's a little hard to define. That's why there's going to be a machloket here. Because hated was sent. Okay, we'll describe it right now. The two options, Rabbi Yehuda Omer, im saneta shalach. If he hates her, he can divorce her. This basically goes back to Rabbi Akiva. Any reason you can divorce your wife. Again, the hate is a very strong term here. We assume they're just using it to get the idea across. Rabbi Yochanan Amal, sanoi hamashalech. The one who sends his wife is hated by God. And that means you really shouldn't divorce your wife. So we have, again, these two extremes. But this time, the Gemara wants you to know they're not actually extremes. The Gemara narrows down this machloket and says that there's not even arguing. Lo pligi. And they're going to talk about something that I think is very hard for us to understand, but we could try to think about it. Again, a lot of this is in context, right? We're talking about laws that were many years ago where relationships were very different. So you have to remember that. You don't hear? Hello? Okay, there we go. So they say here, lo pligi, habezug rishon, habezug sheni. First marriage, second marriage. Okay? Da'ama Rabbi Elazar, kol megaresh ishto rishona, afilu mizbeach morid alav dma'ot. If you divorce your first wife, even the altar cries from it. Okay, the altar in the temple, shene'emal, they're going to distinguish, say, first marriage you shouldn't really get divorced from. Second marriage, it's okay if you get divorced. Again, like I said, very hard to understand exactly. So they say, shene'emal v'zot sheni. This is from those same psukim of Malachi. Ta'asu ksot dim'at mizbach Hashem b'chiva anaka. Okay, cover the mizbach is covered with crying, tears. Me'en od penot el mizbach. God won't turn el mincha. God won't turn to our offerings. V'lakacha v'tzom yitchem. He won't take your offerings anymore. V'amartem alma al ki Hashem me'i bencha u'ben eshet urecha asher ata bagadet ba v'hi chavrita be'esh chavrita. Because you rebel against your first wife. She was the wife of your youth. She was your love. She was your covenant, and you broke that covenant. Now already you can see that the Masechet is ending with this idea about the relationship between us and God as a relationship of a marriage almost, and that they're trying to connect this idea of our relationship with God as one of husband and wife, and that we are God's Ishet Yumim, and we should therefore, like the idea of divorce is almost a slap in the face of God. But again, in context, right, it's using this first marriage and second marriage as their example, right, sort of saying that the first marriage is the ideal, that's our marriage with God, and that should never be broken. And whether it means that you shouldn't get divorced for a first marriage, I don't believe that that's what the Gemara is saying, even though it kind of sounds that way as we end. So what we did today is, again, we saw methods of extrapolating the verses, right? Again, which we said perhaps really is their philosophy about on what basis can one get divorced or not. But what we didn't really answer is, and we saw, again, we didn't really answer the question because we ended up with a big range. But what the real question, or I think is a bigger question, which is why did we end Masechet Gittin with this, and why didn't we start? And in thinking about this, I noticed a connection in the psukim. So we don't have a lot to work with, right? We have these two psukim, or very few psukim that talk about marriage in the Torah. But there's two very important verbs in those psukim. I want you to think about them. Ki yikach ish isha, and this is something we're going to start in Kiddushin already talking about a lot. this taking. And then we have, and when it doesn't work, ki matzah ba'ervat davar or lo timtzah chen beinav, the shoresh matzah. Anybody know where those two roots come up? It's very relevant to this. When woman is created, what does it say? First it says, God says, I need to find you in Ezer Kenegdo. And then he goes to the animals and Sefer Breshit in the second chapter, and it says, Lo matzah lo Ezer Kenegdo. He didn't find. That's the search all the time, the looking for, right? The other one. We all know about the search, how complicated it is to find your right match. And then when she's created, she's taken from his rib, and it says, Ish lukachazot. And that the likicha, the husband after, and we're going to get to this right in the beginning of Kiddushin, which is, I think, the answer to why this comes up, is because this connection of, you're getting married, right? There's the marriage and there's the divorce. So theoretically, Masechet Kiddushin about marriage should have been first and then divorce. But there's actually a commentary called the Yosef Dodge who points out this connection that when you're going into marriage, it's good to know that there's a way out. It's important, but in a very meaningful way. First of all, it might even strengthen first of all, we might not ever get married if we knew there was no way out, right? And that there's this idea, like man was searching, right? And she was taken from him, and the whole search is always to come back, right? And find that, right, that match. And I think that this Masechet is ending really as a lead into Kiddushin. As know before you do Kiddushin that there is a way out, which number one, just gives you the confidence to be able to go, and might even give you the confidence to have a very strong relationship. We always know that knowing you have other possibilities usually makes you feel better about your own choice, right? That you can be good and confident in your choice. So I think that that's how we end this Masechet really with the matzah and the lakach, and we're going to start the next Masechet. We'll do that. We'll actually start the very beginning in another 2 minutes, 3 minutes. But this idea of the two going together in actually a positive way. So with that, we will end our Masechet Hadran Alach Mekaresh Uslif Ala Masechet Gittin. Okay, we have a few more things for today, which is we have a Siyum haShas of 2 women who have been learning for 7.5 years and are going to finish haShas together with us now. I'm going to call them up, Gail Licht and Erica Kolach. And what we're going to do now is everyone can stand up for the Hadrons if you're finishing the Masechet. You can stand up anyway if you'd like. Okay, we're going to say the Hadrons together. And I'm going to share the screen here. Second. I'm going to do it. For a second. Can't do it on present. It doesn't, it's not showing. It's not showing on me because I have, that's why that's covering. Okay. What we're going to do this time is a little bit different because we have women finishing the haShas and they're going to say something a little different. The first paragraph of the Hadran, we're going to say together 3 times. They're going to wait. They're going to say their own because their own is going to include also Talmud Bavli. They'll say it after us and then we'll continue the rest of the text together. Okay, here we go. Hadran alach Masechet Gittin v'Hadra Halan. Da'atan alach Masechet Gittin v'Da'ata Halan. Lo nitnashem minach Masechet Gittin lo titnashem minan. Lo ba'alma haden v'lo ba'alma da'at. Hadran alach Masechet Gittin v'Hadra Halan. Da'atan alach Masechet Gittin v'Da'ata Halan. Lo nitnashem minach Masechet Gittin v'lo titnashem minan. Lo ba'alma haden v'lo ba'alma da'ate. Hadran alach Masechet Gittin v'Hadra Halan. Da'atan alach Masechet Gittin v'Da'ata Halan. Lo nitnashem minach Masechet Gittin v'lo titnashem minan. Lo ba'alma haden v'lo ba'alma da'ate.
Hadran alach Masechet Gittin v'Talmud Bavli v'Hadra Halan. Da'atan alach Masechet Gittin v'Talmud Bavli v'Da'ata Halan. Lo nitnashem minach Masechet Gittin v'Talmud Bavli v'lo titnashem minan. Lo ba'alma haden v'lo ba'alma da'ate. Hadran alach Masechet Gittin v'Talmud Bavli v'Hadra Halan. Da'atan alach Masechet Gittin v'Talmud Bavli v'Da'ata Halan. Lo nitnashem minan Masechet Gittin v'Talmud Bavli v'lo titnashem minan. Lo ba'alma haden v'lo ba'alma da'ate. Hadran alach Masechet Gittin v'Talmud Bavli v'Hadra Halan. Hadran alach Masechet Gittin v'Talmud Bavli v'Da'ata Halan. Lo nitnashem minach Masechet Gittin v'Talmud Bavli v'lo titnashem minan. Lo ba'alma haden v'lo ba'alma da'ate.
יהי רצון לפניך, אדוני אלוהינו ואלוהי אבותינו, שתהא תורתך אומנותנו בעולם הזה, ותהא עמנו לעולם הבא. חנינה בר פפא, רמי בר פפא, נחמן בר פפא, אחי בר פפא, אבא בר פפא, רחמן בר פפא, רחיש בר פפא, סטורחן בר פפא, אדם בר פפא, דרו בר פפא. הערב נא אדוני אלוהינו את דברי תורתך בפינו ובפיות עמך בית ישראל. נהיה אנחנו כולנו צאצאינו וצאצאי עמך בית ישראל. כולנו יודעי שמך ולמדי תורתך בשמה. מהבית תחכמני מצוותיך כי לעולם כי לי. יהי ליבי תמים בחוקיך למען לא אבוש, לעולם לא אשכח פקודיך כי בם תהייתני. ברוך אתה אדוני למדני חוקיך, אמן 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 סלע ועד. יהי רצון לפניך אדוני אלוהי, כשם שעזרתני לסיים מסכת גיטין,
בתלמוד בבלי,
כן תעזרני להתחיל מסכתות וספרים אחרים ולסיימם, ללמוד וללמד, לשמור ולעשות ולקיים את כל דברי תלמוד תורתך באהבה. וזכות כל התנאים והמוראים ותלמידי חכמים, יעמוד בנו ולזרענו, שלא תמות מחשבה מפינו ומפי זרענו עד עולם. יתקיים בנו ותהלכך תנחה אותך, ושוכבך תשמור עליך, והכיסותה היא תשיחך. כי בי ירבו ימיך, יוסיפו לך שנות חיים, אורך ימים וימינה, שמאלה עושר וכבוד, אדוני עוז לעמו ייתן, אדוני יברך את עמו בשלום. שפוך לכולם. Very, very exciting to be here at this moment. Okay, we will learn the first few words of Masechet Kiddushin because I want to move on with the program. האישה נקנית בשלוש דרכים וקונה את עצמה בשתי דרכים. A woman does betrothal in 3 ways and she gets out of it in 2 ways. If you want to know what that means, you're going to have to join the class that starts on Tuesday morning. Okay, I'll end with that for now. I want to introduce now the next part of our program. I'll just tell you what the program is going to include. My husband, Rabbi Seth Farber, is going to speak next. Then we're going to have the 2 women who finished haShas share with us their reflections on finishing haShas, which is always very inspiring. My husband, Rabbi Seth Farber, runs an organization called Gittin, and what's amazing about it, besides all the amazing things it does, it also connects with so many of the sugyot that we're learning. And the most interesting thing in my mind is to see the practical ramifications of all the things that we've been learning. So without further introduction.
Good afternoon. First of all, Mazal Tov, especially the 2 of you are so inspiring to hear. All of you just right behind is quite incredible. I think what's dramatic about the Talmud Bavli is that it represents an effort to bring alive something like 1,200 years of Jewish tradition in one moment. Essentially, the rabbis who were how do we make that which we know to be so central to our tradition alive for people in our generation? That happened maybe once or twice in Jewish history, but it's happening again now in this 3rd era of Jewish history, at the moment when the state of Israel not only was founded, but is doing incredibly well in many, many respects, perhaps not in all, but we're a project in formation here. But the laboratory of the state of Israel is a place where Jewish tradition is coming alive. And therefore, it gives us the great opportunity to take something that happened 1,520 years ago or so, the formulation of the Bavli, and bring it alive. And it's becoming alive in more than one sense, but in the particular sense of the development of halakha and its establishing anchors for this next new moment in Jewish history. One of the great opportunities that I have doing my work is not only trying to change things systemically in Israel, but also not only on a global front, but on an individual front, to help individuals help shape their own Jewish lives in a way that actually sets precedents for the future of what Judaism is going to be. Not just for Jews in the state of Israel, But for us here in Atlantic Beach, or in New York, or in America, or around the world, Judaism is being transformed, and it's being transformed. Two quick stories where the stories of the Bavli came alive. The first one is on this page, the page we just studied, the last page of Masechet Gittin. And it's a story that begins in Los Angeles with a couple that calls us and says, hey, we want to get married in Israel. And we ask them to send us all the papers. They send us everything, and all has all the certifications that they need. And they arrive in Israel. He's American and she's Israeli. And she has actually been married before and was divorced in LA. And they come to Israel just a couple of days before the wedding. And we bring them to the rabbinate, and the rabbinate says, hey, you want to get married, you have to just get a certification from the rabbinical court. And since everything is said and fine and great, who thinks that for 1 second we're going to have to rely on a Rabbeinu Tam, on a Tosfot that appears on the last page of Masechet Gittin, and we're going to have to force that through to allow a couple 72 hours before their wedding to get certified to get married. And by the way, it's not going to happen 72 hours before. It's going to happen something like 2 hours before the wedding. Okay? And what's the story? The story is we've checked everything out. We've gotten all the approvals, etc. at team. When they come to the particular rabbinical court judge, he doesn't exactly love the rabbinical court in LA that did the get for the woman. Okay? He starts questioning that rabbinical court. And even though the chief rabbis have already approved that get, he says, I don't love it so much. So what are they going to do? They're supposed to get married. It's Thursday afternoon, and they're supposed to get Thursday morning, and they're supposed to get married on Sunday. And what are they going to do? And I was representing them in the rabbinical court, and we start saying, but we have all these certifications. He says, no, not going to be good enough. So I said, what do you want? So he says, I want another get from the first husband. Okay. I call them out of court. We step outside. I say, do you have a relationship with your first husband? She says, yes. I said, do you think he'd be willing to give another get? They have to wait 92 days. And if you look at, you don't have it in front of you except for the people who are on Zoom, but if you look in the Tosfot, on the top of Daf Tzadi, it doesn't relate, it relates to the previous sugya, but Tosfot quotes an exact case of Rabbeinu Tam. Maaseh ba lifnei Rabbeinu Tam, sheyatzal get echad kol pasul. There was once a case, now we're talking second get, it's explicit. More than 1,000, almost 1,000 years ago on the page, because of the question that appeared for the of the first get. Rabbeinu Tam said, we can rely on the first get. Now the question, the challenge becomes, and my challenge becomes, how do we take this text, which is not universally agreed upon? Because most people said, hey, the first get wasn't good, so this is the second get, and you have to start again. I can give you a litany of sources. And we went to the rabbinical court on Sunday morning with the get in hand, and this couple right in front of us, and the clock ticking. I remember, because she didn't even come. She was already getting dressed for the wedding. Okay? He comes, and he said, right, he wasn't even the client. She was right? And we argue this Rabbeinu Tam. We say, but it's an explicit Rabbeinu Tam. And then the judges start fighting, but Rambam doesn't say this, and this one doesn't say that, and Shulchan Aruch, and we go back and forth, and that's not exactly the case here. And in the end, I remember exactly what happened. This is the kind of thing you can do in Israeli rabbinical courts. The judge said, I need to take a break for an hour. And that judge wasn't so sympathetic. And we simply found another judge. And in that hour, we got an ishur to get her to get married. The point is, though, that this stuff comes alive. It comes alive in real ways. And by the way, in that precedent, on the precedent I bought, I wanted to just show you for just a second. And I did this once before to see him a number of years ago. This is an amazing document, not because it says she can get married without the 92 waiting period. What amazes me about this document is that it has the seal of the state of Israel on it. Whereas we're creating new halachot in the state of Israel, or we're bringing alive halachot that we weren't able to do before. And it's not just halakha in the local community that maybe will create precedent or not. This document I can use over and over and over again. And just from a historical perspective, you can imagine that today, where there's not, many of you know that I fought very hard in terms of to get the breadth of rabbinical courts in the States, particularly, more rabbinical courts recognized. But when that doesn't happen, we can pull this out and at least help people, even if they have to get a second get, which maybe is necessary, maybe it is, but we can try to get them, we can move things forward quickly. And I personally have used this on a number of occasions. A second case, very quickly, about things coming alive. This I don't think I've ever talked about it publicly, but it's something we've done a number of times, and it's something that's used, and I'm a little hesitant to do it on the Zoom, but I'm going to do it anyway. Okay, as you know, one of the dominant themes in Masechet Gittin, the fourth parak, is Tikkun Olam, fixing the world, and the rabbis are willing to create dramatic precedents in order to enable. And that's really what Jewish life in Israel ought to be today and around the world. Jewish life ought to be enabling. It ought to be empowering. It shouldn't be about putting up obstacles and putting up walls and challenging people. The Aguna story is one of the most painful stories, and most of the stories of Aguna, as you know, are people or women generally, who are caught with the recalcitrant husbands, people who are just, vicious. And one of the cases that came up, that comes up already in the fourth parak, is the case that we've used a number of times. It's come up a number of times in Aguna cases that I've represented, which is the discussion at the beginning of the fourth parak about batel mevutal. The husband has the capacity to give again, and while it's on its way to the woman, to cancel it. I don't know if you remember those cases, and we actually paskin, halachically, we paskin, the husband can do that, and therefore, in many, many cases of Aguna, what I'm involved in, the most famous one that I was involved in is a woman who was in England, and we hired, right, the husband ran away to England, and he took another wife, and it was very, very painful, and finally, we actually ended up sending him to jail for 8 months in England, but at one point, there was this, in the middle of the trial, the judge said, why are you here? Why are you all here? And we actually told the judge, we were very honest, and we said, we're here to get him to give the get. And she called him in, and there was a small window where we thought he was going to give the get, and because he's from the Turei Karta, right? He's a Sam Chassid. We actually were afraid that in between the time he gave the get and the time where the get was received by the woman, which would have been a few minutes, he was going to cancel the get. He knew that trick, and therefore we actually brought the Beit Din it was the first time ever the Beit Din came to the secular courts in London, and they stood outside so we could do the delivery. In the end, he refused to give it. He laughed at the judge. It was horrifying. It was a horrifying moment for me as well. But the question of batel mevutal is an enormous challenge, where the husband has the capacity to cancel the get on the way. But the rabbis actually came up with the principle that was very, very fascinating. They applied something called the rabbis, in certain circumstances of batel, if the husband came along and tried to cancel the get, the rabbi said, we're going to uproot the kiddushin from the beginning. We're going to say it's not, they actually were never married. I don't know if you remember the details, but I want to just play it out for you for one moment. Because some cases, a very, very small percentage of Aguna cases, the cases that I've been involved in, are cases where the woman ended up in Aguna not because of the husband, but just by accident, because they just didn't realize. And we had a case that a woman came to us, and actually her child came to us, and the child came to get married in Israel, and then she was told you can't get married. And of course, we always try to figure out if the first wedding was good or not good, and I've talked about that on other occasions. But in this case, the wedding was, the witnesses were pretty strong, etc. But what happened? The woman was married in Israel, and then the marriage didn't work out, and she just left. She just left. No get, nothing. They just didn't care. It wasn't in their mind. And then she went and had a child with someone else in a different country, and then that child ended up making aliyah and then walking into the rabbinate to get married and being told, as far as we're concerned, right, exactly where mamzer, you're a mamzer, and you're an illegitimate child. What made this case remarkable is that the ex-husband was willing to cooperate. He was willing to help. And here's the precedent that will really knock your socks off. Okay? We tried to show that the original marriage was, there were invalid witnesses, etc. But then we brought the ex-husband, to the Beit Din, and we made the following suggestion. We said there's a Gemara in the fourth parak that says that should the husband come along and give a get and then cancel it, then what did the rabbis do? They uprooted the kiddushin from the beginning. Afkinu rabbanon kiddushin. So we said, we have the husband here right now. We know they separated 20 years ago. We know that. And they were married 25 years ago. And we know this is their daughter. So let's do the following. Have him give her a get right now. Have her step out of the room for a moment. Have him cancel the get that he just gave. And then halachic mechanism is that the kiddushin is no longer valid. But we've simply uprooted the kiddushin. The fourth parak kicks in. A takana that Rabbi Yehuda, I think it was Rabbi Yehuda made, or I don't remember what it was Rabbi Yehuda, but Rabbanan made for it. Rabbi or Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, okay, I turn to the expert here, right? Right. We use that takana to enable a woman to get married by uprooting her kiddushin, not because we found problems with the witnesses, but because we used takana they made many years ago to make sure that this wouldn't happen, to actually make it happen. Now, you might say these are like, legal loopholes. But I see this as part of a process. It's part of a process where we recognize, and this is a lot of what I spend my time thinking about, where we recognize the Jewish law. It's not that it's a dead letter, quite the opposite. What we have to do is try to find the new interpretations of the old tradition to be able to make Judaism something living and breathing, something dynamic, not something static, something that's enabling and empowering, and not something that creates obstacles in front of people. It's well known that sometimes these kind of issues get me in trouble. Many of you know that about me. I'm not scared about getting in trouble. In fact, a lot of the time, I think to myself, if you're not willing to get in trouble, are you really doing a disservice to what the halacha, to what our tradition says? I think one of the dynamic parts of Masechet Gittin, if I had to sum up, the rabbis showed tremendous amount of prowess. They showed tremendous guts, at least for their time, to try to make Judaism something living, something that was relevant, something that was enabling. I'd like to believe that's one of the things that we're doing. And I think one of the dramatic things about what Michelle is doing is bringing the Bavli alive for so many people, particularly women who have had it closed off to them for so long. So I know the real question you're asking in the end, the real question people really want to know from me is, what's it like to be married to Michelle Farber? And the answer is, I'm not allowed to say.
Exactly. He knows his wife. Communication. Thank you. That was an excellent way of really taking a lot of things we learned in the Masechet, particularly that Tikkun Olam, which was such a central part, and making it come alive. I'd like to call Gail first. Okay. I'll call Erica first. 7.5 years ago, Erica and I met I was invited to a scholar in residence. Are you going to talk about it?
Yes.
Okay. So you'll hear more from Erica, but that was the first time we met, and that's how Erica got hooked on learning Nadav. And we're going to hear from her experience learning.
So I'm really going to talk about the experiential part, and it's very personal. So apologies if you're looking for Torah from me.
Yeah.
Thank you for inviting me to speak at the Siyum. It's an honor to be here physically and virtually with so many women and men completing Gittin, and to share the celebration of completing haShas with Gail. I grew up in Halifax, Nova Scotia. That's Canada for people who aren't aware. Attending Hebrew school at the local conservative synagogue. Although I spent a year at Stern College after I graduated from my university, my secular college, Gemara wasn't part of the curriculum. After I married and moved to Silver Spring, Maryland, where we still live, I occasionally attended shul classes and even learned the Mishnayot of Seder Moed in memory of my father. But I never considered learning Gemara or Daf Yomi. But never say never. My mother, Zichrona Livracha, died on February 15th, 2016. That was Vav Adar. And I made a commitment to say Kaddish for my mother at least once a day for the 11 months. While I was a regular Shabbat morning shul goer before then, I'd never daven daily, nor did I regularly go to shul for Mincha Maariv. I mean, on Shabbat. I mean, that would interfere with my nap. But on February 27, 2016, when I was going to shul very regularly at the Camp Mill Synagogue in Silver Spring, Maryland, Michelle Cohen Farber was a scholar in residence and taught the daf, Gittin 76. I had to look it up, and it's still online, that announcement, between Mincha and Maariv. I loved it. Michelle made the daf accessible, and I could follow what she was talking about. On the way home from shul after Shabbat, I said to my husband, I can listen to a podcast and learn the daf. My voice must have been a little questioning, because his response was, of course you can. At the time, I was working about 20 miles from home. If anyone knows Washington, that's a drive that could take anywhere from 35 minutes to an hour and a half each way. And the car became where I listened to the daf. For the Shabbat daf, because there was no recording at the time, I tried several different podcasts, none of which appealed to me. They either presumed knowledge I didn't have, went too fast, or didn't present sensitive subjects with the care that Rabbanit Michelle does. Eventually, I learned the daf myself using the Koran Talmud Bavli. Thank you, Michelle, for starting to record the daf for Shabbat at the beginning of this cycle. I continued to learn the daf in my car on my way to work, even after I changed jobs. Maybe I picked a job in Baltimore so I would have sufficient time to listen to the daf on my drive. Then the pandemic hit and I was working from home. You would think that would make things easier. No commute, but it didn't. I had trouble separating work life and home life. For a while, I floundered, falling behind and catching up. But finally, I found a quiet time to learn. I kept my hands busy with a craft that didn't need a lot of thinking. I find that I need something to busy my hands, to focus my brain on what I'm learning. About 9 months ago, I retired. A lot of change in the last 7.5 years. Again, you would think that would make things easier, and again, it didn't. I spent less time in the car and my home routine was disrupted. I tried attending the Zoom shiur regularly, especially for Gittin, rather than just on Sunday morning at 12:15 a.m. But no one wants to see me fall asleep on Zoom. At least after Shabbat, I've had that nap I mentioned before. So I've settled back into crafting while I listen to the daf. So what have I learned from 7.5 years of daf yomi? Anyone can learn the daf and connect with it. You just have to find the right teacher. If you know someone who is thinking about learning daf yomi, tell them not to wait, just jump in. When I started, I had no idea where I was in the cycle. If I'd waited, I might have lost my motivation. Don't expect to remember many of the dafim in detail. I know, Gita, I'm looking at you. I know there are some who do, but not me. But words and concepts get repeated frequently, and you'll absorb them along the way. I know how a new moon was determined, what a treifa is, and the different parts of the Beit HaMikdash and what happened where, though I do have a map of the temple on my wall in case I need to remember. Finding a regular time to learn the daf really helps me. When I fall behind is when I don't or can't follow that advice, or when my schedule changes. And if you can attend the Zoom sessions, do it. I've enjoyed the ones I've attended immensely and wish I lived a few time zones to the west. For me, having the cards that Hadran provided for Nashim or an English translation nearby helps when I forget the meaning of a concept or word that is central to the current discussion. One theme that I noticed that runs through Gittin is thinking ahead or planning for what comes next. And I'm sure you can see where this is going. Bli ayin hara, I am looking forward to learning Kedushin Bat on Tuesday, celebrating the Siyum for Kedushin in Poland in November, and celebrating with the entire Hadran community in June of 2027. Mazal tov, everyone. Is anybody parked in front of us?
Anyone parked in front of the yellow house? Yeah.
Hold on 1 minute. Taking a break.
Oh, that's me.
Oh, can someone else move it or? Someone move- Okay, they'll do it. Yeah. Should've gone first.
But it
Okay.
was good. I like this. Now
Now I'm-
I have a little different perspective. Okay, that's good.
Okay, Gail Licht is the head of our Hadron of Teaneck group and a big inspiration to many women in her community who came here today with her. And we're very excited to hear from you.
Thank you.
Just keep it close to your mouth and try not to. Close.
When I undertook to learn the daf 7.5 years ago, I was not looking to learn Gemara for the first time. I had already been learning with a group of men and women twice a week, covering tractates in depth for a number of years. Rather, I was looking to commit to some type of daily learning to enrich my life by devoting time each day to learning Torah. The option I chose was learning the daf. It seemed like a natural progression from learning Be'iyun, and I felt it would give greater context to the Masechet that I had already learned. Living in Teaneck, I searched for the daily daf that was the latest in the morning and joined the Keter Torah daf. I was welcomed to this all-male daf and was made to feel at home. For the first few years, I had no idea that Hadron existed. Around the time of the Siyum haShas in January 2020, I saw an advertisement for a women's Siyum in Israel. I was very excited to learn that Hadron existed and was going to have a Siyum, and decided to go to Jerusalem to join the Siyum rather than go to MetLife Stadium where I would have been in the bleachers, even though I myself was not yet finishing. I sat in the hall by myself, surrounded by over 3,000 people, mostly women, only a handful of who were actually finishing Shas, but with many women who had started learning or were there to support those who were finishing. It was an amazing experience to be in the presence of women who had completed Shas and to hear very learned women speakers giving Divrei Torah. From that day on, I became a Hadron groupie. Especially during COVID, I listened to Rabbi Seth Farber religiously. With the start of the second cycle, Hadron formed a Teaneck Hadron group, as I'm sure they've formed groups all over the world, and it was possible to relate and identify with other women learning the daf. I tried to organize with some of the other women to have a siyum every time we finished the Masechet, so that we could come together, learn together, and give each other encouragement. I also put together a group to learn on Shabbat, first in my backyard post-COVID, and then at the local shul, in which the Teaneck Hadron group joins together with the Keter Torah daf, which continues to this day every Shabbat, usually given by Rabbi Weil. To me, learning in this environment with men and women is the ideal way for everyone to be exchanging ideas and contributing. When I think of what I have accomplished today and what I can share with you, I can tell you that my approach to learning the daf has been to set aside time each day in the morning and learn the particular day's daf to the best of my ability. I usually have the Gemara open in front of me and start and stop the podcast given by Rabbi Seth Farber numerous times in order to digest what I have learned, review, and read some of the notes in my trusty Koran Gemara. I use regularly the charts prepared by the Rabbanit to follow the shiur. It can take me anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour and a half to do the daf. I try to focus on taking away some lesson, moral, ethical, halachic, practical, that can guide me throughout the rest of the day. I start this process each day anew. A few days into the daf, I probably have forgotten that which was so clear to me a few days ago. When I first started, this bothered me terribly. But now I am content to know that on that particular day of the daf, I did have a full understanding of that day's daf. Recently, we went through a few dafim of medical remedies, which we mostly reject as ineffective in light of modern medicine. However, I was able to identify with the fact that thousands of years ago, migraine sufferers would try any remedy, even slaughtering a bird and rubbing against it to alleviate pain. I remember myself many years ago, before the current slew of miracle drugs, willing to try just about anything to alleviate the excruciating pain of a migraine, including hitting my head against the wall. Truly ineffective. Also important to me in the last few years has been knowing that I am a part of a larger group of women committed to learning the daf. In the many years that I attended Shiurim and Gemara in my neighborhood and continue to attend, I'm usually the sole woman in the group. I have also tried over a few decades to champion the growth of institutions devoted to teaching women Talmud so that my daughters would benefit from such an education by supporting these schools, their leaders, and taking an active role on their boards. I am proud of my two daughters who are here today, who after attending Ramaz High School went on to learn at Migdal Oz and Midrashat Lindsbell. I strongly believe in the message of Hadran, that the study of Talmud is central to everyone's ability to function as a Torah true Jew. In Baba Kama 15a, in its comments on the words, Eila hamishpatim asher tasim lifnehem, these are the words that you have said before them. The opening words to Parshat Mishpatim, the school of Rabbi Eliezer states that scripture has made women and men equal regarding all the laws in the Torah. Rashi in Eruvin 54b tells us that the unusual use of the word set before them, tasim lifnehem, rather than teach them, connotes an obligation for the teacher to make sure that the student has fully mastered the material so that they may apply it and do the mitzvot. We as students charged with the imperative to learn and master the laws of the Torah have all begun this journey by learning the daf. I am proud to call Rabbi Seth Farber my mentor and teacher and a person who has inspired me to continue to learn. She fully embodies that which Hashem commands Moshe and Yoshua in Devarim 31:19 in transferring leadership. Kitvu lachem et hashira hazot v'lamda b'nei Yisrael zima b'fiham l'man tiyeh li hashira hazot la'ed b'nei Yisrael. Write this song for you and teach it to the children of Israel. Put it in their mouths, that this song may be a witness for me against the children of Israel. I have also listened to Shiurim of Rabbanit Shimoni and Rabbanit Dreyfus of Gefet, which gives me the encouragement that we are making strides in producing learned women that can serve as role models for our community at large, especially to our young women. I have also been privileged to join the Matan Daf and listen to Shiurim at Matan when I spend time in Israel, given by scholarly women, broadening my understanding and knowledge of Torah, which enhances my observance of mitzvot and gives me true strength. I am hoping to finish the next cycle with Hadran so that I will be able to attend the next Siyum in Jerusalem as a Messiah, not just a supporter. I am hoping that new opportunities will be developed by Hadran and others to learn Halakha and Gemara in depth, and I will be able to continue learning. I think it's important for us as women learners to take the responsibility to enhance discussion on some of the more difficult issues that relate to us as women that we have been exposed to while learning the daf. I know shockingly, there was no appearance by the wife nor her shaliach. A man stepped in to be the wife to show how the get would be given to her and accepted by her. I think this visual presentation would have looked a lot different if Hadran had initiated the video. I would like to take a moment to thank my family for their continued support in this endeavor, and obviously for showing up today. It's been a long ride. I have been privileged to raise a wonderful family steeped in learning and chesed, and have among them those who are engaged in learning the daf, learning Mishnayot with their children, and also educating the next generation of young people in Torah. While I like to think that I am a role model for them, they are inspiring me each day to be a better person and a better mom. I would also like to acknowledge some of my other Gemara teachers, including Rabbi Moshe Kahn, Zichrono Livracha, with whom I took my first formal Gemara class, Rabbi Yosef Adler, whose Monday night men's Gemara class I was a regular at, and to Rabbi Meyer, who has taught a twice-weekly Gemara Chabura for the past 15 years, of which I have been a devoted participant. My love of learning and my ability to complete the cycle is attributed to having learned from these true Talmidei Chachamim. Lastly, I would like to thank Rabbanit Michelle Farber for her devotion to teaching us each day and presenting her the daf in a clear and erudite way. Without the ability to tune in every day to her sweet voice, I'm not sure I would have made it. I would like to close with the words of Mishlei, Proverbs. Amor l'chachma achalti at, u'malda l'chachma tikra. Say to wisdom, you are my sister, and call understanding your kinswoman. Rabbi says with regard to this verse in Erev 54b, to set appointed times, moadim, for Torah study. May we all merit to be able to set aside time each day to do the daf, and may we join together in Yerushalayim at the next Siyum haShas. Thank you.